will history view the American invasion of Iraq, a classic conquest or liberation of an oppressed people? And what will future generations say about George Bush, a visionary or a war criminal? Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azzawi. When history is written in 50 years from now, how will it describe the American enterprise in Iraq? An epoch-changing campaign or the worst military adventure in the history of the United States? And will historians claim the invasion heralded the decline of an empire or consolidated American world domination for decades to come? Imran Khan reports.
This was the moment the Middle East was supposed to change. The bombing of Baghdad in March 2003 was a sign that American-style democracy was due to define the coming century. US President George Bush took every opportunity to tell us he was making history.
In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
He declared mission accomplished. This was the shot he hoped would come to define his presidency. Even as history was being written, the Americans were not prepared for how wrong things could go in such a short time. Is it too early to judge the US invasion as either success or failure? For one academic, the answer is clear. If America wanted to have a positive impact on history, then it should have paid more attention to Iraqi society rather than military technology.
You know, Iraq is, it has a diversity of history and sects and the culture. So all the race, all this, it was not well calculated by the American administration.
But what lessons did the US learn from the history of this invasion?
First of all, it is incorrect to change regimes from outside. This is one lesson should be learned from the invasion. The second is don't give promises which you are not capable of doing it in the future.
It's not just him. Other American thinkers go even further. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright called this war the most mismanaged and the worst military misadventure in the history of the American Republic. Others go even further, predicting the decline of America as a superpower, falling at the hands of the so-called insurgents. So, what are we witnessing? The decline and fall of America or the violent, bloody beginnings of a new Iraq? The top US commander is confident that the violence has slowed down. However, it may be too late to secure a positive legacy for the US president. History will judge President Bush. Whether it's visionary or war criminal remains to be seen.
How Iraq will be remembered is largely up to the politicians of today, and they're desperate to be remembered as a force for good. However, the current situation is not the one that they had envisioned when they began their adventures in 2003. History is a cruel mistress, and one that cannot be manipulated easily. Imran Khan for Inside Iraq.
To find out whether history will be kind or harsh to President Bush and his big gamble, we have invited three historians to help us peer into the future. It is true they don't possess crystal balls to predict the future, but perhaps they have seen this movie before while studying world history. From New York City, I am joined by Richard Bullitt, Professor of History at Columbia University. And from Jerusalem by Israeli military historian Martin van Creveld of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And here in Doha by retired Colonel Alistair Campbell, Director of Royal United Service Institute for Defense and Security Studies in Qatar, better known as RUSI. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Iraq. Richard Bullitt in New York, let me start with you. It is often said that journalism is the first draft of history. When that history is written, say in about 50 years from now, how will it view this American enterprise in Iraq?
I think it's very difficult, obviously, to predict very much, as you say, but one of the most consistent things in the last 50 years in the Middle East has been American policy, the basic shape of it. You know, we have had a consistent interest in every administration in the in normalizing Israel as part of the Middle East, in security and inexpensive oil supplies, and in first the denial of communist influence, now the denial of what we consider radical Islamic influence. In that context, we have overlooked a lot of bad policies, misguided efforts, and so forth, because these American policies are driven by domestic considerations here. I think that we will look back on the Bush adventure as a terribly mismanaged, mishandled war, but if in the long run American objectives are achieved, then it won't look so bad. And I think that the one thing to keep in mind is that unlike Vietnam, for example, whenever we withdraw from Iraq, we're not withdrawing from the region. We are still going to be permanently implanted in the Middle East, in the Gulf, and it makes a difference.
When you talk about misadventure, Professor Bullitt, one always remembers Vietnam, and Professor Van Creveld wrote an article under the title, "Why Did Iraq Will End Up as Vietnam?" Do you see the similarity, Professor Van Creveld? Will this result will be inevitable, just like the demise in Vietnam?
I thought that from the beginning that this war cannot be won. In fact, I was so convinced that it would end in failure that I thought that the Bush administration was bluffing. After all, President Bush himself once said, and I quote, "I'm from the Vietnam generation. Do you think I'm stupid?" End of quote. Turns out, yes, he was stupid. Yes, he led the United States into this adventure. And I don't see how it can end well. It's taking longer than I expected, and General Petraeus is doing a good job. But as far as I can see, even as he is reducing the number of casualties, he's at the same time also weakening the Iraqi government and preventing a political solution. Sooner or later, I suppose the American people will lose patience and say enough is enough, which in my view they should.
Given the stupidity of President Bush aside, Alistair Campbell, and that is by Van Creveld, not by this presenter, how about Blair? I mean, the British, they had a tremendous experience in Iraq, and over the years, they relied on their colonial power experience, not only in India, but other places. So what possessed Blair to join into this misadventure? Was he not present in school that day when the history of Iraq was given?
I think Mr. Blair did go to war probably against his better instincts. I think he'd much rather have had a full, unequivocal international support for it, but he made the decision to join the Americans and to help them score goals as opposed to shouting abuse from the touchline, as other nations did. He may regret it now, but that's history. But I think in a broader context, history will probably in 50 years' time judge the Iraq intervention more reasonably than we do at the moment. As you look around now, we see the chaos and killing, and we think it's disaster. But actually, when history puts in a broader context, they will probably see that we got rid of one of the least pleasant regimes of his generation, a regime that murdered its own citizens, invaded neighbours, and have placed it with a government which, although incompetent, is representative and also answerable to the people. So history will, in a broader context, judge it rather better. I do, though, agree with what Professor Van Creveld said. I thought that the Americans would not go to war initially because they hadn't got enough troops. It's very un-American to go to war with fewer troops, although the initial, controversially, the initial invasion was quite successful. General Franks did topple the regime very quickly and effectively. The mistakes came afterwards in the reconstruction phase.
Professor Bolt, I see there is a convergence of view between you and Alistair Campbell, and on the sharp end, Van Creveld, he is looking very pessimistic at it. Sentiments not very far from Madeleine Albright said. You know, this is a mismanaged war. This is the worst military misadventure in the history of the Republic.
Well, I think it's been terribly mismanaged, and I think that we still have a further opportunity to mismanage the withdrawal of the war under the next administration. I don't think that we can look at Bush at the moment without realizing that some of the toughest work is going to be done by whoever succeeds him, and that person will either brilliantly show what good policy can do, or they will muddle through in a way that does not add any more distinction, but perhaps lessens the incompetence of Bush in historical memory. But I think that one of the problems here is that looking simply at Iraq and at the United States and thinking in historical perspective, one has to realize that there are other things that are going to go on in the succeeding years that are going to, in many different ways, put the Iraq War into some sort of perspective. One of them, of course, is the potential of a confrontation with Iran.
This process of isolation, Professor Van Creveld, also reminds me of, in your article, you said the Americans, they were using a sledgehammer to knock holes in thin air. Is that what they are doing in Iraq? Or as Richard Bullitt said, you know, we have to look at it in its totality from Middle East, whether it's democracy, whether it's stabilization, whether the upcoming confrontation, whether with Iran, or later on, domination of oil against China.
When I wrote that, I was thinking of the military side. The American forces in Iraq were indeed using sledgehammers against flies or nets, and that was perfectly true. Since then, as we've all known, we all know, they have a new commander, a very capable man, and he has realized three things. He has realized, first of all, that his job is not to kill as many insurgents as possible, but to protect the people. He realizes that what you need is not all kinds of satellites and computers and networks and things like that and sensors, but people on the ground who will know the situation, in other words, human intelligence. And he's also realized a third thing, namely that where an army cannot go, a donkey that is loaded with gold often can.
I do think that General Petraeus brought a counterinsurgency doctrine with him, and the old Sanchez-Bremer doctrine of kill more bad guys has now been put back in the history book. And I think history will show America has learnt how to conduct these counterinsurgency operations from Iraq. Although I think the moral standing of America has suffered enormously as a result of the Iraq invasion, I think military might is probably still there, and has probably increased in capability as a result of what they've learned in Iraq. I hope they will be less inclined to do these interventions without full international support, but the military might will still dominate the Middle East for some time.
Alistair Campbell, gentlemen, stay with us. I'm going to take a short break now. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion. Stay with us.
It is one of history's ironies that the first war in Iraq, a war of necessity, marked the beginning of the American era in the Middle East, and the second Iraq war, a war of choice, has precipitated its end. Richard Haas, Council on Foreign Relations.